Carly Newberg sighed and closed the thick book on government contract law that took up most of her desk. It was time to go home. She was in her office at the school where she worked as a law teacher, but it was for one of the law firms for which she also did research work. If she left now, she would have enough time to catch her regular train home. Her husband had left on a business trip that morning, but she no longer feared his trips like she had in the early years of her marriage. A full 2 weeks without her husband must be refreshing, and she was looking forward to returning home. They met in college. Her husband, David, was a couple of years older and about to graduate from business school, while Carly was still undecided about what she wanted to do with her life, halfway through her undergraduate degree. She smiled, remembering the night they met at a fraternity party. If only everything could remain as perfect as that night, she thought sadly, her smile fading as she turned off the light and locked the door behind her. They had been together for 18 years, almost half of her life, she realized with surprise. She loved her husband more than anything in the world, but in the last few years their marriage had begun to fade. They were married for 15 years. In the early years of their marriage, David supported her pursuit of a law degree, but lately she had been earning more as the company he owned ran into financial difficulties. Last year, she started taking on litigation cases from a firm she worked with years ago to make ends meet. David was a perfectionist and avoided admitting his shortcomings. This was the root cause of the problems in their marriage, and his recent dependence on her was the latest and greatest reminder of his failures. There were many things she loved about her husband, but his stubborn pride was not one of them. Walking across campus, she headed to the station for her ride home. There was an early evening chill in the air, reminiscent of the fact that mid-autumn had already arrived. She was comfortable in a light sweater over a blouse and knee-length skirt, but she would need a coat soon. Seeing the station, she noticed that her train was approaching and hurried, knowing that he would not wait long. She made it just in time, falling onto the empty seat a little out of breath. Almost immediately, she felt the gaze of the man opposite her, sliding over her skin. Carly was in her early 30s, with dark hair that fell just below her shoulders and smooth white skin that was trying to maintain a light summer tan. The short run in the cool air had left her cheeks slightly flushed, something she knew men find irresistible. Tall 5.5 feet, with an athletic build thanks to her religious devotion to running and a pair of breasts that seemed proportionate to her slender figure, she was pretty, if not exactly beautiful. David loved big breasts, but still fell in love with her and married her, which she reminded him of every time he hinted at implants. The man opposite, with short dark hair slightly gray at the temples and a Magnum pie mustache, seemed captivated by her charms. He was not one of the regular passengers on her evening trip, one of those people who became her silent and nameless companions. In front of her today sat a girl she called Red, a short girl with countless piercings and a star tattooed on the back of her head, with bright red hair when Carly first saw her. This week her hair was green, but to Carly she will always be a Red. On the other side, behind Magnum, sat Big Beard, an older, balding man with a scruffy beard. He had a wedding ring on his finger, and she always wondered how his wife let him get by without trimming the thing. There were a lot of people she recognized, but Magnum was definitely new. Turning her blue eyes back to him, she blushed under his bold gaze and nervously showed her dimples. He also wore a wedding ring, but looked more than willing to forget about his wife for one night if the opportunity arose. While reading her book, she often glanced at him, becoming nervous under his unwavering gaze. She was not afraid of a crowded train, but would change her seat if there was a free one. As the train began to make stops, she said goodbye to the faces she knew, knowing their stops as well as she knew her own after all these years. As soon as another seat became available, she moved, but Magnum's gaze followed her. The closer the train got to her stop, the more she prayed that it would get off soon. Relief filled her when he stood up a few stops before her and got out. Even from outside the train, he looked at her until the train left. Getting off at her stop, she ran to catch the bus that would take her home from here. She had her own car, but traffic and parking in the city were a nightmare, so she rarely used it to commute to work. Magnum's looks left her shocked, and she was still nervous even though she knew he wasn't there. It wasn't that she felt threatened by him, but he shared more than just a mustache with Tom Selleck. He was blessed with rugged masculine looks and broad shoulders. Carly had to admit that she found him attractive, and that was the danger. His gaze left no doubt in her mind that he was willing to share much more than just glances on the train. Although her marriage had been less than ideal lately, she had never thought about cheating on David. On the other hand, she was sure that most people don't plan affairs, they just happen. Well, nothing would happen between her and Magnum, no matter how many warm feelings his handsome face evoked inside her, despite the chill in the air. Entering home, she locked the door behind her and leaned back against it with relief. Safe inside, she hoped David would call tonight, even though he didn't check on her every night on his trips like he used to. Magnum's face kept popping into her head as if she had seen him before as she went to the kitchen to pour herself a drink. She pulled out David's good scotch and poured herself a strong drink, downing it in one gulp. He really doesn't look much like Magnum. It was the mustache that made her make that comparison, but his face was just as handsome and familiar. Maybe she had seen him on the train before, but she didn't think so. Either way, he was gone now, and it didn't seem likely that she would see him again, which meant her worry was in vain. It was a small part of her that was worried that tonight would be the last time she would see him, which made her drink another glass. As she tried to concentrate on preparing dinner for herself, she found it impossible to escape his piercing gaze. Carly knew she had a good figure and a pretty face, but it was easy to forget that when her husband no longer showed much interest in sex. As she cut vegetables for a little stir-fry for herself, she began to wonder who he was and why he showed such obvious interest in her. She couldn't imagine herself cheating on David, but the feelings that another man's interest aroused in her were amazing. Thinking for a moment, she couldn't remember the last time her husband had looked at her with such desire. When dinner was ready, she ate in the living room while watching TV. Switching channels, she found no relief, only reminders of her admirer. Everywhere she looked, from the local newscaster with a mustache to the Jeopardy host who looked different after shaving his mustache, she found vivid reminders of the man she called Magnum. In the end, she switched to a children's channel, but could not watch it for long because it caused her pain. Turning off the TV in disgust, she put the dishes in the kitchen sink and went upstairs to her office. Shortly after marrying David, they bought this large 4-bedroom house filled with dreams of the children they would raise here. As Carly walked into what was supposed to be the bedroom for one of her children, she felt a sadness wash over her that hadn't happened in years. For her, law school seemed like something to do while she waited to get pregnant, but she became a member of the state bar and began working full-time at a firm before being forced to admit that something was wrong. David supported her, said that he was ready to do whatever it took, but how quickly everything changed when her doctor said that the problem was not with her, but with him. Her husband refused to accept any kind of defeat and could not bear to ask for help. Suddenly, he said, they didn't need children in their lives. Carly loved him enough to not press the issue, but now that his interest in her had waned and he was spending more and more time on the road trying to save his failing company, an empty house was her cruel reward. Every day of her life, she wished that the problems were in her so that they could at least try some of the treatments. She shook her head, thinking about some of the things people had said to her. "Oh, Carly, you're so lucky that you can travel all the time and not have to worry about kids." Or, "You have such a great figure, Carly. I wish my figure was the same as it was 20 years ago, but I don't. Got back into shape after having kids." "Are you lucky?" "Wonderful figure." People could be so stupid sometimes. She knew that none of them meant to be offensive, but if they knew how much pain her comments caused, she was sure she would never hear them again. Sitting down at her computer, she logged into the school's secure server and downloaded the files she needed to review for tomorrow. These are going to be a busy few weeks, and every little bit helps. If they fail to settle one case, she may have to spend several days in court on top of classes and other work. But trying to concentrate on work was useless. With an empty house and thoughts of a stranger who had shown interest in her, she began to wonder if it was too late to have children. Shaking her head, She stood up to pour herself some wine. Carly loved her husband more than anything in the world, despite his foolish pride that cost them so much. But tonight her thoughts were leading her down a dangerous path. With a glass of wine in hand, she returned to her home office and closed her work papers. Despite being so busy, her heart was not in the right place tonight. While checking her email, she read a message from her sister inviting her to dinner this weekend. She smiled, thinking about her niece and nephew and the opportunity to spoil them again. When she felt depressed due to the absence of her own children, her sister's children always received pleasant surprises from their favorite aunt. Where had she seen Magnum before? The more she thought about it, the more sure she was that she had seen his face before, and it wasn't on the train. Checking her browser history on the page she had been reading a few days ago, she immersed herself in exploring the site and was finally able to temporarily take her mind off questions about who Magnum was. When she was done with the website, she left her office for the night, turning off the lights. After running the bath, she checked her figure in the mirror, taking off her clothes. Her friends were right. She did look much the same as she did 20 years ago, but she would give almost anything for a C-section scar or a stretch mark from the woman who gave birth. Submerging herself in the warm, soothing water, she dipped her head below the surface and emerged, tucking her wet hair behind her ears. At the beginning of their marriage, David gave her everything she wanted, but lately she felt horny and unsatisfied all the time. Carly was never shy in bed, one of the things that helped her win over her prince, and had no problem taking care of her own needs. She had other men before David, but none after meeting him. Some of her craziest fantasies included a faceless second man joining them in bed, and she smiled as the fantasy filled her mind. When the second man appeared with Magnum's face tonight, she gasped and quickly opened her eyes. The Magnum in her head was furiously having sex with her. Afterwards, as she dried herself off, she felt colder and dirtier than when she entered the water. Maybe David will call tonight. It will be good to hear his voice, she thought. She didn't have high hopes. It was the first night of this trip, and she was sure that he valued this space as much as she did. Calling him at the hotel was impossible. She hated bothering him unless there was something important, and if he wasn't there, he would return her message as soon as he received it, no matter the time of day. While brushing her teeth, she avoided meeting the guilty gaze in the mirror. She gave up drying her hair, planning to shower in the morning to get rid of the frizzy hair and not have to face herself right now. Throwing the towel off the foot of the bed, she crawled under the covers, naked and vulnerable. Carly closed her eyes tightly, but sleep remained elusive. Looking at the clock, she saw 11:17, 11:44, 12:20, 12:52, 1:09, 1:36. The next morning, she was glad she didn't meet Magnum on her ride. With an early morning session, she managed to keep it out of her head all morning. She had 2 law offices to visit that afternoon and asked her department secretary to see if a third meeting could be arranged, which came up at the last minute. While having lunch alone in her office, she was checking one of their credit cards online and realized she would need to contact the bank for more information. "Hi, this is Carly Newberg. I need a fax of our purchases on this card for the last 2 years. Can you do it?" "Great. Of course, I can confirm any account information you need," she said, answering the lady's questions. "I'm trying to remember when and where we bought this laptop, which now doesn't work. I lost the receipt, but I seem to remember that the store signed us up for their extended warranty, and I wanted to see if it was still in effect before I replaced it. Thank you. You have no idea how much this helps me." "Here's the fax that came for you, Carly," her secretary said, walking into her office a few minutes later. "I also arranged that last meeting for today at 4. "Thank you, Janice," she said, taking the fax and looking through it. "This is exactly what I need," she said, looking up from the sheets with a wry smile. She still needed to match the date and location, but she had the proof in her hands. That afternoon, she rushed through her first 2 appointments to leave enough time for the last one. It was something urgent that just arose, but the deadline was short. She had less than 2 weeks to get this case in order, and her most important client was counting on her. Heading to the last meeting of the day with documents that needed to be reviewed in her bag, she was greeted by the company secretary and invited into the office where she was expected. "Carly, it's good to see you again. Janice said you had something important to discuss with me. I hope nothing serious," said her friend and colleague Charlie Dunn, standing up to greet her. Her first job out of law school was at Charlie's firm, and he always cared about her. On the first day of dating, she was very nervous, but he joked about how similar their names were, which immediately calmed her down. "I don't think so, Charlie, but you're an expert on this sort of thing, so I was hoping you could take a look at it," she said, taking a folder out of her bag. "Let me read," Charlie said, picking it up and looking into her eyes before he began to read. He nodded as he read and looked up several times, shaking his head, as if pondering the legal significance of what he had read. "I guess you're going to try to make this hold up in court?" he asked. "Yes," she said with a nervous smile. "Well, it looks perfect," he said, nodding his head. "Even with the recent changes in circumstances?" she asked. "No such conditions were provided there. The agreement is clear and precise," he assured her. "I'm sure you can win this case with your eyes closed, but you know that I'm always ready to help if you need it." "Thank you, Charlie," she said, now smiling with relief. "I was hoping that I could hire you to help me with this matter." "Well, then you got me. Barbara and I both took the rest of the week off to look after our grandchildren, but if you'd like to stop by tonight, I'm sure we can put together a good deal in a few hours," he said. "You're the best, Charlie," she said, standing up to hug him. "There's a lot more to it than that, trust me, but I need to do my research first. I should have all the details by Thursday evening." "It sounds good. How about 8? The kids should be in bed by then, and we'll have plenty of time to discuss everything," he said. "See you then," she said, putting the folder away on her way to the door. Carly had been confident before meeting Charlie, and now she was confident that they could win the big thing. Of course, he was her friend, but she knew that wouldn't stop him from giving an unbiased opinion. She was confident they would have something good by Thursday. Meanwhile, she planned to check with several other experts on the subject. It was unlikely that they would find anything that Charlie might have missed, but like any good lawyer, Carly prided herself on being prepared, and this case was too important to allow the unexpected to get in the way. It wasn't until she boarded the regular train home and met Magnum's gaze that she thought about him again. Her meeting with Charlie left her in a good mood, so he didn't bother her like he did yesterday. Giving him her sweetest smile, she tucked her hair behind her ear and sat a few rows ahead of him, smiling to herself as she blushed. There was no reason why poor Magnum shouldn't have had some fantasy material given what she had done with him last night. "Carly, nice to see you again. Janice said you had something important to discuss with me. Hopefully nothing serious," said her friend and colleague Charlie Dunn, standing up to greet her. Her first job after graduating from law school was at Charlie's firm, and he always took care of her. On the first day of dating, she was very nervous, but he joked about how similar their names were, which immediately calmed her down. After dinner, she sat in the living room, looking through her interior decorating magazines. This was her hobby, which she did in her free time. Their beautiful, clutter-free, child-free home drew compliments, but what would she give for the box overflowing with toys in the corner that would look completely out of place? She decided that she would redecorate some of the rooms when David returned home. Carly tried to focus on the patterns and color schemes, but there were too many sad thoughts running through her head, and she soon burst into tears. Closing the magazines, she went to bed early. Tomorrow she had to go for a run before work, and she had to get up a little before 6. The next morning she got up at dawn. Putting on a tracksuit, she ran out the door with a bottle of water. Following her usual route, she pushed herself and was soon covered in sweat, despite the cool autumn morning. It was just her and the sidewalk, no sad thoughts or tempting strangers. Finishing the run in a near-record time, she ran a second, smaller lap before entering the house to shower and get ready for work. It was another busy day with classes in the morning and visits to several law firms in the afternoon. There was so much to try to fit in that she made several evening appointments, so they could quickly review the big case with her. So far, none of them had found any potential difficulties that Charlie might have missed, and they assured her that there was nothing to worry about. Carly knew she couldn't be too careful when it came to the lawsuit, but the fact that all the news so far had been good allowed her to relax a little. Taking the much later train home from her evening's meetings, she yawned and began to think about bed. She felt someone's gaze from the side, and before she turned her head, she already knew that it was Magnum. The first evening she had wondered where he had suddenly come from, but now he was here again, hours after her usual trip. There was no doubt in her mind that he was stalking her. As long as they were in a crowded public place, she wasn't too concerned. He continued to look, but she did not smile at him that night. There was no reason to encourage him even more. Relief filled her as he got off at his usual stop. Even though he was gone, she still kept looking over her shoulder nervously the rest of the way home. When she returned home, she decided to take the car tomorrow, despite the traffic jams. This will make it easier to get to Charlie's after work. Instead of going home first, she could go to him immediately after the last meeting. The early morning and long day had left her tired. Climbing into bed after a quick dinner, she felt excited again, even after her frightening encounter with Magnum. It wasn't that she was afraid he would hurt her, but she was afraid of what pursuing him would lead to. His greedy gaze dominated her thoughts and made her excited. Would she be able to hold out until her husband returned, or would she give in to his silent suggestions? The next morning she drove to work by car, glad to avoid her silent admirer. That was the weirdest part of it all. He looked at her non-stop, but never said a word. His eyes made his intentions clear, and she was sure the other people on the train must have noticed it too. If he had approached her on the first day, she would have rejected him immediately, but now he was wearing down her morals day after day, plunging her into fantasies. It didn't help that she still hadn't heard from David, and only saw reminders of the difficulties in their relationship everywhere. All she needed was to hear his voice for him to tell her he loved her and Magnum wouldn't stand a chance. What kind of husband goes away and doesn't call his wife for almost a week, she thought angrily. Her morning classes passed in a blur. While eating lunch alone in her office, she closed the door and cried until there were no more tears left. With that out of the way for the time being, she got ready for the big afternoon. As she walked to her car, ready to leave for her first meeting, she felt her skin crawl and knew he was looking at her again. Looking around with a challenge on her face, she challenged him to show his face. As she got into the car and drove away, she prayed that he wouldn't be able to follow her. At one point, she didn't see him in the parking lot, but she knew he was there, and it shocked her. After the last meeting of the day, she called Charlie and asked if she could come a little early. He heard the fear in her voice as she explained what had happened over the past few days. "Come in, my dear," Barbara said, greeting her at the door with her arms already open for a hug. "You're safe here with us. This terrible man cannot harm you here," she said in a soothing voice. Carly looked up to see Charlie standing a few steps away with a worried expression on his face. Her parents now lived in Florida, but here, with these old friends, she felt almost at home. "I brought a folder to study," she finally said. "Leave her to me, and I'll deal with it tomorrow," Charlie said, and she nodded, grateful for the opportunity to lighten her load. "I fed my grandchildren before bed, but our dinner is still being prepared. You will have dinner with us," said Barbara. It was a statement, not an invitation, although Carly would have gladly accepted it. Over dinner, she opened up to her friends, finding solace in their sound advice. They both offered to do whatever they could to help her, but she assured them she could handle it. Tonight, she needed to lean on the people who loved her. Tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, she would cope on her own. After a few laughs and many tears, she stood up to leave, feeling that she would always be indebted to her friends for their kindness. "You should stay with us tonight," Barbara said as Carly stood up, looking for her bag. "Oh no, I can't impose," she said, feeling guilty for dumping all her problems on them. "Nonsense," Barbara shook her head. "We don't have any free beds with the grandkids here, but you can share the bed with me and Charlie can take the couch for one night." "Really, it's not a problem," Charlie quickly added. I'm so grateful for friends like you, but I'll be fine as soon as I get home, she said. Well, I don't like it, Barbara said, looking at her husband and waiting for him to act. She shouldn't be alone at a time like this. If we can't convince you to stay, let me at least walk you home, Charlie said, and his wife smiled and nodded. Please, you've already done more than enough this evening, she said. We can't force you to stay, no matter how much I want to, Charlie sighed. Will you call when you get home so we know you're okay? I promise, she said, smiling and hugging them goodbye. She tried to hold on in front of her friends, but the road home terrified her. Left alone with her demons, she fought to maintain control. The desire to turn off the road and cry almost overwhelmed her. She knew David wasn't going to call, and she knew Magnum would be looking for her tomorrow. Most of the time, she thought she knew what she was going to do, but every day that little part of her heart, which was uncertain, became more and more. When she got home, she looked around for a long time before getting out of the car and quickly heading towards the house. Frantically searching through the keys in a hurry, she began to cry before she found the right key and slipped inside. Frantically setting off the alarm after locking the door behind her, she leaned against the door, breathing heavily. Before calling Charlie, she forced herself to take a few deep breaths, which calmed her down. As soon as she hung up, she went to the bathroom and ran a bath. The next day, she left the car at home. This meant that she would probably meet Magnum again, but after a night of soul-searching, she was no longer afraid of him. No amount of his looks could make her do what she didn't want. Her day followed its usual routine, classes in the morning and meetings in the afternoon. Having finished her meetings earlier than usual on Friday, she caught the regular train home. Where is he? She thought, looking around the carriage. She waited to run into him, but he was nowhere to be seen. It was for the best. Meeting him again would be dangerous. Carly knew exactly what she wanted to tell him, but it was easier this way. The drive home was the most relaxing I've had all week. She could read her book in peace without anyone staring at her. From her train station, she made the short walk to where she was waiting for the bus. He was supposed to arrive any minute, judging by her watch. Still worried about meeting him, she looked around at the other people waiting for the bus until she was sure he wasn't there. Entering the bus, she felt completely calm. After a short ride, she got off and waited for the bus to leave before crossing the street. With no traffic in either direction, she took a step onto the road and stopped. Magnum. He stood across the street, giving her his now familiar piercing gaze. Suddenly, all the words she wanted to say to him disappeared from her mind as fear overtook her. Taking a step back, she walked up the street. Turning her head to look across the street hopefully, she saw him there, keeping pace with her, his eyes locked on her. She cursed her decision to wear heels today, knowing that she had no chance of escaping him. They were getting closer to her house, and she was on the wrong side of the street. Carly didn't know what to do. Should she continue walking to the gas station on the corner, or go to the neighbor's house? Once in front of her house, she noticed that Magnum had stopped several houses back. At that moment, she was sure that he knew exactly where she lived. Either he was offering her a safe path, or he was setting a trap. Her mouth went dry and butterflies fluttered in her stomach. Reaching into her purse for her keys, she ran across the street to the safety of her home. Magnum followed her down the driveway at a safe distance. On the threshold of the house, Carly dropped her nerve keys and turned to see him a few steps away from her. "Who are you?" she demanded. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, raising his hands and taking a step back. "I asked who you are," she said in an angry voice. "My name is John Smith," he said. "Yes, of course," she snorted. "And I'm Jane Doe." "What are you doing?" she asked anxiously, pressing her back against the door as he reached into his coat. "It's just my wallet." "Look," he said, waving his wallet. "See for yourself," he added, throwing it at her feet with a soft throw. "Stay there," she said, crouching down to take the wallet, keeping her eyes on him. She took the opportunity to pick up her keys. Opening his wallet, she pulled out his Maryland driver's license, and sure enough, it said John W. Smith. Even his photo seemed to undress her with his eyes. "Okay, John Smith, what do you need?" I think it's obvious, he said with a smile that was all too familiar, catching the wallet as she tossed it back. I'm married, she said, raising her hand to show off her wedding ring. Me too, he said, showing her his ring. Was your marriage everything you dreamed of? He asked in a bitter voice. I don't want anything to do with you, she said, ignoring the wetness between her legs. Are you sure about this? He asked, taking a step towards her. She saw that he was waiting for her to say stop, but she never did. He stood right next to her now, and her fear evaporated. When he tilted her chin, she knew what was coming next. He leaned down, stopped so close to her lips that she could almost feel him, and waited. The cruel bastard didn't want to take away her honor. He waited until the desire became unbearable, and she was forced to give it herself. As soon as their lips touched, he quickly responded. It had been years since she had been kissed like this, and she felt her knees go weak as John kissed her as good as Magnum in her fantasies. Carly was breathless when their lips parted, and she was delighted to see the promise of so much more in his eyes. They shouldn't have done it here where the neighbors could see them. Turning her back to him, she unlocked the door and walked inside on trembling legs. She didn't bother inviting him to follow her because there was no need to. Once they were inside, he grabbed her from behind and started kissing her neck. Leaning back with her eyes closed, she sighed with pleasure, basking in the hot attention she had been waiting for so long. They had sex, so long awaited. She suddenly felt vulnerable and ashamed of what she had done. Glove-thigh inside, she knew she was better than this, and wondered what had happened to the woman she once was. After what had happened, she didn't want him leaving to cause any difficulties. I knew from the moment I saw you that you were going to be hot, he said, grinning at her stern face. What we did here, it shouldn't have happened, she said evenly. But it happened, he said. You need to leave, she said as she walked away. Do I even know your name? He asked. Carly, she said before she could stop herself. She had already shared too much with this stranger. Carly, he repeated her name as if tasting it. That's a beautiful name. You're right, I need to go, he said, glancing at his wedding ring. But is this what you really want? This was not what she wanted. She wanted him to stay and have her all night, like she had been fantasizing about all week. Carly wanted to say, stay. She wanted to say, take me again. But just like when she let him in, it was easier for her to remain silent and let him do what he wanted. Taking out her husband's favorite scotch again, she poured them both a glass. She felt strange sharing his scotch with another man, but considering what else she had already shared with him, she didn't see how it could hurt. John accepted the glass with a smile and clinked it with her. He didn't propose a toast because, in truth, neither of them had anything worth celebrating in their lives at this point. Having drained the glass, he held it out for refilling. Carly poured him another and put the bottle away. She didn't want him to get drunk when she barely knew him. Taking a moment to study him up close, she found his masculine appearance incredibly sexy. His strong jaw and thick mustache made him look so masculine, and she had felt the strength of his strong arms and broad shoulders as he held her earlier. John was taller than her husband and looked in good shape with a flat stomach under his shirt. Leaving her bag and work folder on the kitchen table, she headed towards the stairs, knowing that he would follow her. She thought about asking him what he wanted to do, but there could only be one answer. Leading him upstairs, she led him to the guest room. As much as she had lost her way tonight, she couldn't bring herself to bring him to her own bed. This she could save for her special man. The room looked so sterile and uninhabited that he should have immediately known that this was not her bedroom, but he didn't care where they had sex. At the foot of the bed, he attacked her with a flurry of kisses, lifting her into his strong arms. Together they fell onto the bed, a tangle of writhing limbs. It was a long, passionate night. Paroling off her with a groan, she pressed herself against him, kissing his chest. He had helped her more than she could ever imagine, and she could never thank him enough. She didn't know what to say, and he was breathing heavily. Taking a pack of cigarettes from his coat, he offered her one. Carly shook her head, but kissed him again and ran naked to get the ashtray. Having first looked into her bedroom for a robe to hide her vulnerability, she handed it to him and watched him smoke. After going to the bathroom, She took a long time to freshen up and returned to the empty guest room. "John," she called, looking around, but his clothes were collected and he left. Going downstairs, she looked out the door and saw him walking down the street. Having locked the door, she sank to the floor, suddenly feeling cold from inside. The tears she had been waiting for all night finally came. That night her sleep was full of nightmares about David catching her in bed with John. In one of them, David had a gun and shot him in the chest while he was having his wife. She jumped out of bed screaming, picked up the gun after he dropped it, and turned towards him. Smiling at her smugly, he opened his mouth to say something, but instead of a tongue, a snake slithered out of his mouth, and she pulled the trigger, waking up in a cold sweat with the loud sound of a gunshot still ringing in her head. Jumping out of bed, she turned on the heating and returned to bed, shivering, wondering if she would ever feel warm again. The next morning, she woke up feeling dirty and full of shame for what she had done. She was better than that. How could she let this happen? But it was useless to think about the past. She usually didn't wash before running, but now she felt her skin crawling and took a scalding hot shower that failed to cleanse her soul. Carly loved to run in the morning. It always helped clear her mind, no matter what she had to deal with, but she couldn't get John out of her head. When she returned home, she locked the door behind her. She wanted him again, but she wasn't ready to face him if he showed up now. In her master bathroom, she filled the bathtub, ready for a long soak. She immersed herself in a bath of warm water that reached almost to her neck, adding more hot water as it cooled. Carly wanted to stay there all day while she struggled with her emotions. Submerged under the water, she held her breath until her lungs began to burn and her head began to spin. Breaking out of the water, she gasped for air, ready to face what her future would bring. Once dry and dressed, she called her sister to let her know she'd be arriving a little early. She still needed to buy a surprise for the kids and stopped at a toy store along the way. Usually the thought of visiting a toy store made her sad, but today was different. Now, with special gifts for her niece and nephew, she made the hour-long drive to her sister's house, arriving a few hours before dinner. Her sister Cindy greeted her at the door with a hug and immediately knew something was wrong. The children ran up to greet their Aunt Carly with a kiss and a hug, and then ran off to play with their new toys. Cindy and her husband Steve invited Carly in, and although they could see something was wrong with her, they knew they would wait until the kids went to bed to ask questions. They sat in their sister's living room, drank a glass of wine, and talked. When it was time for Cindy to finish preparing for dinner with Steve, Carly went downstairs to play with the kids. After dinner, the five played a board game until it was time to put the kids to bed. After receiving another kiss and hug in gratitude for the gifts, their father took them upstairs to bed. Carly smiled after them and then looked at her sister's serious face. "Okay, what's wrong with you, sister?" Cindy asked when they were out of earshot of the children. "Nothing," she said, but she knew her sister wouldn't buy it. "You're older than me, Carly," my sister began with a smile. "But you can't trick me that easily. Are you going to tell me what's wrong, or should I call my mom?" Taking a deep breath, Carly opened up and told her sister what had happened this week. By the end of her story, her sister hugged her and cried with her. When Steve returned, she briefly told him the story to explain their tears. He reacted with anger, ready to track John down and teach him a lesson for hurting the woman he considered his big sister. She made him promise not to do it, explaining that it was also her fault. It was nice to know that they were both ready to support her in any way. Why couldn't her marriage be as good as theirs? She thought with a little envy of her sister and her loving husband. David had once held her like that, she thought, looking at Steve's protective arm around her sister. Later, over a cup of coffee, when the tears had stopped again, they sat and reminisced about the past. Steve and Cindy were high school sweethearts and spent weekends on the town with Carly when she and David were first dating. They laughed about how one day their father unexpectedly came to visit and almost caught them together. The parents did not approve of Carly and David living together without marriage and would be furious if they found out that Steve was joining Cindy during her visits. At the time, it seemed like they would be together forever, But David no longer went with Carly to visit his sister and barely said a word to Steve the last time Carly invited them to dinner. Carly suspected that her husband was jealous of Steve because he gave Cindy 2 beautiful children, but never spoke about it. It was about 10 when Carly put on her coat to go home. Cindy tried to convince her to stay, but she refused. She assured them that she would be fine and invited them to dinner at her place the following Saturday. The drive home gave her time to think. The next week was very busy, but despite all this volume of work, she thought only about John. He was from out of state, here for work, as far as she knew, and may have already left. The thought of him disappearing from her life so quickly suddenly saddened her. When she arrived at her house, she realized that she had forgotten to leave the light on before leaving. It was cold, hinting at the frost of the night, when she got out of the car, buttoning her coat. Feeling for the key in the darkness, she looked closely at the lock, trying to insert it. "I was about to leave," he said from the darkness, scaring her half dead. "Oh, thank God it's you," she said, relieved to recognize John's voice. "You scared me. You shouldn't have come here again." "You didn't want to see me?" he asked. "I want to see you," she admitted, "but we shouldn't be seen together." "No one will see anything here," he said, bringing his hand inches from her face before she could see him. "You know what I mean," she said, smiling into the darkness. "I'll leave if that's what you want," he offered. "You can stay tonight," she said, opening the door. "But next time we should meet at your hotel," she added. She was no longer going to deceive herself about her intentions, and she didn't see the point in deceiving him either. Only when they were inside did she notice that he had brought her flowers. She took them and raised her head for a kiss that turned into something more. Throwing the flowers on the floor, she threw her arms around his neck and kissed him deeply. The more she kissed him, the more she began to like his mustache. Everything about him screamed masculinity, and he seemed so sweet and caring, except that he was cheating on his wife so he could be with her too. More than anything, she wanted to fall asleep and dream of a world where her life wouldn't be so confusing, but she forced herself to stay awake until she was sure he was gone. She needed to lock the door before going to bed. On the floor next to the door, she found a note with his address and hotel room number. Smiling, she took it upstairs with her. Waking up early in the morning in an unfamiliar bed, she quickly took a shower before going for a run. She thought it was stupid to shower before getting sweaty again, but the morning after her second night with John left her feeling dirty. Suddenly, she decided to throw away the piece of paper with his address, although it was already too late. She remembered it last night and was sure that she would go to him tonight, despite how bad she felt right now. As she set out to jog along her usual route, she let the thud of her steps on the sidewalk clear her mind. Concentrating on deep breathing and physical exertion, she forgot about John for a while. As her thoughts returned, she focused on work for the next week. She will conduct her usual classes all morning, and her afternoon will be filled with activities. There were so many meetings to attend and others yet to be planned that it was enough to keep her mind occupied beyond her novel. As that word flashed through her head, she paused for a moment, completely stunned. It had not occurred to her until now that this had become a romance. Once might have been a forgivable mistake, but twice, with no end in sight, it was an affair that would undoubtedly destroy her marriage. When she got home, she didn't shower right away. Going to the kitchen, she prepared herself breakfast and looked with disgust at the mess in the kitchen. After eating, she stayed in her workout clothes to clean the house, starting with the kitchen. Once she finished with the dishes, she went upstairs to remove the sheets from the spare bed for laundry and vacuumed downstairs until it was time to put them in the dryer. Engrossed in cleaning, she went upstairs and cleaned the bathroom, looking longingly at the tub, knowing that she would soon take a long bath. After the sheets were returned to the bed, she carefully looked around the room, making sure everything was in its place before heading to the bathroom for a well-deserved bath. Easily immersed in the warm water for a long swim, Carly sighed and closed her eyes. She thought back on her life with David and wondered where it all went wrong. Was there anything she could have done differently? Remembering all the good times they had spent together, she was overcome with an overwhelming sadness. Falling into uncontrollable tears, she plunged into the water up to her chin and hugged herself to drive away the emptiness and cold in her heart. Carly wasn't sure where her life would take her from that day on, but she knew her immediate future included visiting John for more forbidden sex. After a long bath, she wrapped herself in a warm, fluffy towel and went to her bedroom. Searching her closet for something to wear tonight, she let the towel slide off her slender body. Looking in the mirror, she twisted and turned, trying to find something that could turn her husband away. Lifting her medium-sized breasts, she wondered if maybe those implants he always hinted at could help, until she became angry. Carly was always attentive, which helped her in her career as a lawyer, and she knew that many other men before John found her athletic body attractive. Running her fingers over the birthmark, she knew it wasn't the problem. David admitted that he found him attractive the first time they made love. Her face couldn't be a problem either. She was a bit plain in appearance, with thin lips that she relied on makeup to enhance, and straight, unremarkable hair that was a dark brown, almost black color, but there were other features that made up for it. Bright blue eyes, smooth, creamy skin, and a pair of cute dimples made her look younger than she really was. Although she was 5 years older than Cindy, people often confused her with her younger sister. The more she thought about it, the more she was sure that the lack of heat in their marital bed over the past few years had little to do with her. To hell with him, she thought bitterly. He got what he deserved in the end. Tomorrow it will be exactly a week since he left on his business trip, and he has not called her yet. There could not have been a clearer sign of how little she meant to him. Once again, she told herself that she would no longer shed tears for a man who had not shown his love for her for so long. Tonight, when she returned, she would see if she could keep that promise. From her closet, she selected a scarlet top that showed off every detail of her modest cleavage. She didn't feel like wearing a skirt today, and while going through her trousers, she found the perfect thing, black leather trousers that she hadn't worn in years. They hadn't gone clubbing in a while, and the last time she remembered wearing them was to a Halloween party 3 or 4 years ago. She knew at first glance that they would still fit and remembered how they hugged her hips and butt. Perhaps even David would still find her attractive in them. Placing her top and pants on the bed for now, she applied some scented body lotion before putting on a red lingerie set. In the bathroom, she was ready for the finishing touches. A couple of drops of perfume, and she proceeded to apply it to her face. She didn't need much time, but she used a little blush to add color to her pale cheeks and a little eyeliner to highlight her eyes. Her lips were the feature she felt insecure about. Applying red lipstick to them, she smiled to herself and kissed the mirror, leaving a perfect trail of red lips on it, staring back at her. After blow-drying her hair, she used a curling iron to add some volume to the ends of her otherwise straight hair. Grabbing her purse and keys, she hurried downstairs, putting on her cute black shoes and coat before leaving the house. The hotel where John was staying was not far, but even a short trip gave her too much time to think. The first 2 times she cheated on her husband, John came to her. She was going to meet him tonight with one thing on her mind. Carly knew their marriage was already over before the first time, but that didn't mean it was easy. If he was already over, then enjoying herself with a man who made her happy was something she had to allow herself. Sunday traffic was light, and she parked at the hotel. As she took the visitor's seat, she wondered how long she would be here. Just a second, his voice came from inside as she knocked on the door. He opened it, holding his cell phone to his ear, and gave her a worried look. "What?" he said into the phone, clearly surprised. "Oh, it's just room service," he said, putting a finger to his lips and ushering her inside. "Look, I'll call you later, okay? Okay, see you tomorrow, bye." "Is it your wife?" she asked, noticing how good he looked even in a simple blue t-shirt and jeans. "Yeah," he said, walking past her and closing the laptop before she could look at the screen. Collecting the papers from the table, he stuffed them into his briefcase and put it away. "I was sure you would come, but I didn't think it would be so soon." "Sit down," he said, pointing to the chair in front of her. "Do you love her?" she asked, lounging on the unmade bed instead of sitting on the offered chair. "Whom?" he asked, still confused by her unexpected appearance. Your wife. Do you still love her? She asked. Do you love your husband? He answered defensively. I asked first, she said. I don't know, he said with a sigh. There are a lot of things I love about her, and I can't imagine leaving her and the kids. He shrugged, trying to find the right words to complete the thought. What we did. I feel guilty about it, but at the same time I can't stop. With you, I feel a spark that hasn't been there in years. Do you cheat on her every time you leave? She asked. Does it matter? He asked in response. No, not for me, she answered honestly. There were others, but there were none like you, he said. Yes, of course, she said with an incredulous laugh. What about you? He asked, touching her leg. You were my first. I was a virgin about cheating before you, John, she said, making a joke out of her shame. And your husband, do you still love him? He asked, sliding his hand higher. Part of me still does, but I know he doesn't love me anymore. Not only does it make what we do possible, but it makes it easier every time, she said, taking his hand and pulling him towards her. The conversations were pleasant, but that's what she came here for, she thought as he kissed her deeply. It was so nice to lie under a strong, handsome man who could satisfy all her feminine needs. With the first long, passionate kiss, she felt her skin flush. Running her fingers through his hair, she held his face close to hers, enjoying the feel of his spiky mustache on her soft skin. Reaching over, she began to lift his shirt, and he took the hint, taking it off himself. The sex was hard and fast, but too fast for her taste. Carly looked at John as he rolled away from her. He was handsome, no doubt, but now that her eyes weren't so sex-hungry anymore, he didn't look any better than her David. Despite this, he showed that he truly wanted her and valued her body, which was never exactly what her husband actually desired. She got up and went to the bathroom, feeling his gaze on her. Returning to the room, she saw him sitting at the computer, finishing up what he was working on earlier. Whatever it was clearly not intended for her eyes. He was still naked, and that was all she cared about right now. Leaning down, he kissed her and pushed her back towards the bed until she tripped over it. John left her to go to the bathroom. He sat down next to her, not showing any shyness in front of her. Sitting up against the headboard, John ran his hand through her hair, brushing it away from her face with a gentle touch. It made her feel closer to him than she should have. Your husband doesn't sleep with you anymore, does he? He asked, breaking the silence. Yes, he's asleep, she answered defensively, but then wondered why she should protect him. I just don't get as much as I need, and you. He didn't understand. Do you often have sex with your wife? She asked. Oh, my wife, he said as if it was easy to forget. If I got what I wanted from her, I wouldn't be here. Well, I think she's stupid, she said, caressing his cock playfully. They seem like they would be perfect for each other, he said with a smile. I can't imagine my husband doing something like that. He's too much of a perfectionist to stoop to cheating, she said with a sullen expression. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that, he said, touching her hand. This must be hard for you. The first time I felt terribly guilty, but that didn't stop me from repeating it again and again. Can we talk about something else? She said, shuddering from the sudden cold. She didn't need him to remind her of her own shortcomings. You look cold, he said, standing up and hurrying to the bathroom. Here, put this on, he said, handing her the robe and caressing her body again. Thank you, she said. Why don't we order dinner at my company's expense, he suggested. What do you want? He asked, reading the menu when she agreed. John ordered dinner to their room while he got dressed. She felt strange when they chatted and waited. The sex with him was good, but she didn't really know him. No matter how well he had her, there was nothing to talk about. She wasn't looking for a new man. The relationship with David was almost over, but she still had time to find new love. The conversation with John was awkward, and she didn't know what to say. There was no future with him, and she had already decided that she liked him enough to sleep with him, which didn't leave much to talk about. When the food arrived, she was glad for the distraction. Carly hurried to the bathroom when she heard the knocking to hide. The waiter didn't know who she was, but she didn't want to be seen as easygoing or a traitor, although the latter was absolutely true. John called her after he left, and they sat at the table, eating dinner in silence. She felt vulnerable with only a robe covering her nakedness and couldn't wait until dinner was over to have sex again. When they were both naked, she didn't feel so insecure. Sitting opposite him, she felt his eyes linger on her legs and tried to look under her robe to her chest. At least he wanted to see them, and that relaxed her a little. After dinner, John went to the bathroom. Looking around for something to do, she wanted to turn on the TV, but changed her mind. It was a busy week ahead, and she didn't have enough time to stay here long if she needed to. The sex left her tired and relaxed, but there was still time for one round. How much longer will he be here? How many more times can she fuck him? She heard the bathroom door open behind her and turned around to see John undressed again. Standing up, she threw off her robe and stepped naked into his arms for a passionate kiss. Feeling her body melt against his, she closed her eyes, moaned and squeezed his firm buttocks with her hands. Without a word, she stood up and hurried to the bathroom. Her hair was disheveled and her face was glowing after passionate sex as she looked at herself in the mirror. Getting into the shower to wash off before heading home, she tried in vain to wash away the sins of the day with soap and water. With her eyes closed and her freshly washed hair clinging to her head, she let the water hit her face as she contemplated what the future held for her. 20 minutes later, she was no closer to a solution when she turned off the water and went out to dry. Returning to the room with a towel covering her nakedness, she collected her clothes from the floor. John was still naked and watched her movements with a smug smile that said he was great today and he knew it. Dressing quickly and turning her back to him, her resentment disappeared and she turned to him with a warm smile. "Thank you for a wonderful evening, John," she said, giving him her sweetest smile. "It was my pleasure," he replied in a sincere voice. "When will I see you again?" she asked at the foot of the bed. "I'll be here all week," he replied. "Only a week?" she asked quickly, although in her heart she knew she was lucky his trip would last this long. "Only a week," he confirmed. "We'll have to make the most of this time," she said, leaning in to give him a long, passionate kiss. Carly slept peacefully that night. With the amount of sex John had given her, for the first time in a long time, she didn't need to please herself, and her mind was free to think about other things. David became less important every day. A week ago, if she had been asked, she would have said that she loved him more than anyone and anything in the world, but how quickly everything changed. Now, if she had the chance, she would change him for John in a heartbeat. She assumed there was a chance that her marriage would somehow survive, but she was too realistic to give it more than the bare minimum chance. The next day was long, even by Monday standards. All day she thought about the possibility of seeing John again in the evening, and time seemed to stand still. It was a pity that she was so busy, otherwise she would have canceled some meetings, although John was probably busy during the day too. It was painful to think about losing him so soon, but without his persistent pursuit, she would never have been able to face the harsh reality of her doomed marriage. She owed him more than he would ever know, but during the rest of the week she would have a chance to show her gratitude. Looking forward to seeing John again, she arrived at the station early, but the train was late, which upset her. She almost called a taxi for the expensive ride home when the train finally arrived. The delay made her frown, wasting time. What if John leaves thinking she won't come today? She decided to get off at the stop near his hotel rather than go home. Standing up as the train slowed to a stop, she felt the curious gazes of some of the regular passengers on her. Who are they to judge her? They could all go to hell, she thought, leaving the train and not looking back. "I'll be there soon," he shouted from inside when she arrived at his room a little later. "Hard day?" he asked, seeing the anger on her face as he opened the door. "Oh, John," she sobbed, snuggling into his warm chest. "SHHH, it's okay, Carly," he said, kissing the top of her head. "I know how hard it is," he whispered, misreading her emotions. They spent another night of passionate lovemaking. Every night that week, Carly walked straight to his hotel after the last meeting of the day. Despite the traffic jams, she drove to work to avoid another train accident and the accusatory glances of her acquaintances. Ducklings, as much as she looked forward to their evening together, she dreaded the weekend. John was leaving on Saturday morning after rescheduling his original Friday evening flight to earlier in the week so he could spend another night with her. On Friday, she went to his hotel for the last time, with such conflicting thoughts in her head. She could never thank John enough for filling the void in her heart where love for her husband once bloomed. 2 weeks. Almost 2 damn weeks, and he hasn't even called her. Well, if this experience taught her anything, it was that living without her husband was not as difficult as she had imagined. After parking the car, she sat for a few minutes, calming down. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door and walked towards her lover. Her stomach churned with nerves as she rode up the elevator. Turning down the hallway towards his room, she took one last deep breath to calm herself and smiled before knocking on the door. John must have been waiting impatiently for her, because the door opened almost immediately. "You look beautiful," he said, taking her hand and running it down her arm. "You don't have to say that," she said, blushing and looking away from the heat in his eyes. Today, she didn't even go home after work to freshen up. She looked the same every day of the week. "It's true, Carly," he said, leaning his head down to kiss her neck, to which she sighed. "Your husband is a fool. He doesn't understand how lucky he is." "Let's not talk about him," she said, biting her lower lip and looking past his shoulder. "Sorry, I didn't mean to." He began to apologize. "It's okay," she said, smiling at him as he pulled away from the embrace. "But I'd rather enjoy time with a man who appreciates it than worry about tomorrow." Raising her hands behind his head, she pulled his lips to hers for a kiss. It felt so good, so right, that she had to remind herself that this could never last forever. His hands grabbed her buttocks and pulled her towards him. Carrying her onto the bed, he lifted her high and threw her on the bed. It was a little quick, but Carly only had herself to blame after she'd tried her best to seduce him since the moment she arrived. She still barely knew the man he was attached to, but the sex was so good that they could do the rest. Maybe she was deceiving herself. David had been so cold and distant since his business began to fail that any man who showed even the slightest interest in her would seem remarkable in comparison. Sex with a new partner was always passionate at the beginning, but who said it would last? As good as it was with John, she was looking for much more than sex. She needed a new man and a new life. Carly wanted a second chance to have the marriage she had dreamed of since childhood. A caring husband and beautiful children in a home full of love, that's what she needs. She still had a chance, but there was no more time to waste with a selfish man who didn't love her. "Do you want to go to dinner?" John suddenly asked, bringing her back to the present. "No," she said, her thoughts still racing. "I just want to stay here today," she said. "How about I order you something nice instead of room service?" he suggested. "I would love that," she said with a dimpled smile. "What should we order? Do you know the city?" he asked. He buttoned his pants, but left his shirt unbuttoned. "Do you like sushi? I know a great place that will deliver, but it's a little expensive," she warned. At the same time, she pulled off her bra and reached for the zipper on the back of her skirt. It was never too early to seduce him again. "Order what you like, and so do I," he said, handing her the phone. After ordering dinner, her eyes met his, and she decided to have some fun. At first, she was ashamed to be naked in front of a strange man after all these years, but a week of passionate lovemaking relaxed her. The feeling of his approving glances sliding over her bare skin filled her with excitement. Knowing that a man found her so attractive was a huge relief after years of neglect from her husband. Wearing only panties, she began to pose on the bed while he sat in a chair with a cigarette in his hand and watched. Just as she closed her eyes to rest, there was a knock on the door. "John!" she exclaimed in panic as he wrapped himself in a blanket to hide his nakedness. "Just hide your face," he said, half laughing. His hand was already on the door, and she didn't have time to run to the bathroom. Burying her head under the pillow, she tried to curl up into a ball, but she knew the delivery man would still see her. "Just put it on the table. Sorry for catching us in the middle of something," she heard John say. "Ah, yes," the guy muttered, Carly felt her heart pounding as two eyes devoured her naked body. She heard John's buckle jingle as he reached into his pants for his wallet. "Here's your money," she said, and then there was silence for what seemed like an eternity. "Hey, here's your money." "Oh, sorry. Thanks," the guy said, and the door closed behind him a moment later. "Well, this guy got the best tip of the night today," John said, laughing next to her. "I can't believe you did this to me," she said, lifting the pillow from her head. Her anger was already evaporating, and the excitement of being seen took over her. "Relax, Carly. All he saw was an anonymous fine ass," he said. "He couldn't take his eyes off you, and who could blame him? The poor guy was probably hoping that I would invite him to join." "Damn you, John," she said, immediately starting to look for clothes. "It was just a joke," he protested. "Maybe if I hurry, I can catch up with him," she said, heading towards the bathroom with clothes in her hands. "Let me go," she exclaimed as he grabbed her hand. Pressing her against the bathroom door, he kissed her. She tried to resist at first, but it was too good to resist. "Sorry," he said with a sad look in his eyes, apologizing for this and much more. "If you still want to leave." Carly dropped her clothes and jumped into his arms, muffling his words with kisses. Back on the bed, John had sex with her gently this time, kissing her tenderly and making her feel great. The food was left forgotten on the table while they made love. Afterwards, they sat naked, leaning their backs on the head of the bed and ate dinner. They were only sent chopsticks, and John was completely clumsy with them. After several unsuccessful attempts, when his chest ended up in the sauce, he looked at her helplessly. With sadness in his voice, John mentioned the early departure. She took the hint and led him into the bathroom for a warm shower together. Returning to the bedroom after drying, she walked past her clothes and lay down in bed, patting the empty space next to her. "What are you doing?" he asked. "I want to stay here tonight," she said in a low voice. "If it's not right, I'll leave, but I'm not ready to lose you yet." "Of course it fits," he said, lying down next to her. The next morning, he woke her up with a kiss. Smiling, she let his lips linger on hers. Even after last night, she was yearning for one more round before he left. Reaching towards him, she felt his shirt on and opened her eyes in panic. "No, John, you can't leave yet," she exclaimed, and tears welled up in her eyes. "My plane leaves in an hour," he said. "I wish we had more time, Carly, but this is the end." "When will I see you again?" she asked. "Again?" he asked, clearly puzzled. "I need to see you again, John. What we have here is special," she said, letting out the emotions she had been avoiding. "Forget about your wife and my husband. We have each other now. Listen, Carly, it was fun for a week, but—" She saw him looking for a way out. "Oh God, what a fool I am," she said, trying to hold back her tears. "What have I done? My husband," she said in panic. "I can't believe I did this to him, to us. I need to tell him. I need to explain how sorry I am." "No, you are crazy. Listen to me, Carly. Are you listening to me?" he asked, waiting for her nod before continuing. "Just because there is no future for us doesn't mean you have to put up with it. Don't tell him anything. There are many men who dream of a woman like you. I'm sorry it can't be me, but you will find the right person. I will never forget this week," he said, kissing her lifeless lips one last time before turning and leaving. Outside, he took a deep breath. He's done a lot of terrible things in his life, but these last 2 weeks have been especially hard for him. Having caught the elevator to the lobby, he paid the bill and said that there was still a woman in the room who would leave within the hour. On the street, he got into a taxi and turned on his laptop, asking the driver to take him to the airport. Just as Windows finished loading, his cell phone rang. It was early, so he immediately knew who it was. It's time to make amends with Carly. "Hello? Yes, I'm on my way to the airport now. No, I didn't find anything, sorry, David. As far as I can tell, your wife does two things while you're away, running around and working late," he said, watching a video of her taken by a hidden camera in his hotel room. This was true until he turned on his charm and seduced her himself. David had hired him before to investigate employee fraud, but this case was different. A few months ago, he contacted him looking for a way to dissolve the marriage contract. David had an affair for several years and wanted to leave his wife for her, but couldn't afford to give Carly her share of the business, which was already struggling financially. So David hired him as a detective to find some dirt on Carly that would help him escape his obligations. As in any business, he promised results and knew that it was easier to create incriminating evidence where it was too difficult to dig. Carly wasn't the first married woman he seduced to ruin her marriage, but she was the first one he truly regretted afterward. She just met this Charlie, you called her uncle, and her sister over the weekend. She also visited law offices while you were away. I know this is not what you wanted to hear, he said, closing the video and deleting it from his hard drive. I don't know. You can continue to live a lie or accept the consequences. I know that I promised results, but the costs remain in any case. Void a check? You know what, David? It's normal. Next time you have a rat in your accounting department, go somewhere else. I hope you get what you deserve, he said, hanging up and turning off the phone. Looking through the photos he took, one by one, he deleted them. Poor Carly deserved so much better than that creep of a husband. He wished he could stay, but she deserved better than him. After removing the fake wedding ring, he organized his wallet and carefully hid the fake ID. It wasn't worth the risk of getting caught with him while boarding the plane. The airport was already in sight, ready to send him back to his empty life. Turning to look at the city, he hoped that Carly would take his advice and start a new life. As soon as the door closed behind John, a satisfied smile appeared on her face. Where are all the people who said she was wasting her time in drama classes in college now? She almost told him she loved him, but that might have been too much. Hopefully this will be enough to keep him from telling David what happened, but it doesn't matter. Charlie told her there was no way out of this prenuptial agreement, and the best divorce lawyers in town agreed. However, it will be nice to see the look of complete shock on his face when she hands him the divorce papers and tells him that she knew all about his business trips. That first night, she realized that she had seen Magnum somewhere before. She refused to call him John because it wasn't his real name, and neither was Magnum. It was only while sitting at the computer that she remembered. Her husband had already used his detective agency to investigate fraud among employees. A few days before he left their website open on her computer, which triggered her memories. The question became, why is he following her now? Suddenly, she had to look at her crumbling marriage from a whole new perspective and prepare for her own investigation. Once she knew what to look for, everything became obvious. David had been so clumsy in his attempts to hide what he was doing that she felt stupid for not realizing it sooner. This fool even paid for hotels and dinners for himself and his mistress using the credit card they both used. Of course, she never used it, but her name was also on the account. David and his dependence on his precious miles. This thought made her laugh out loud. He wouldn't buy a loaf of bread without using this card. She couldn't wait to tell him that was how she knew for sure. Everything was on the extracts. A business trip to Florida, but visiting a hotel in the state, a conference in Chicago, but a romantic dinner for two at a chic restaurant in the city center, a trip to Montana to visit a sick uncle, and flowers from a local florist. Flowers. When was the last time he brought her flowers? Some of the trips may have been real, but she was able to match enough incriminating purchases with the dates in her diary to realize that he had been cheating on her for the past 2 years. She only checked 2 years of credit card statements, but that was enough. It would hurt even more to know exactly when it started. Despite the lack of passion in their marriage, she did not stop loving him until she realized that he had sent someone to spy on her. She could even try to overcome betrayal, but the thought that he considered her capable of such a thing disgusted her. For the first week, she didn't know what to do. The support of friends like Charlie and Barb and her sisters and family helped her calm down. She had already told them everything, and they were ready to help her in any way. In the end, she decided that the best revenge was to fuck the man her husband had sent to spy on her. The fact that this spy was a handsome and talented lover was an added bonus. This was another surprise that she hoped to give in person. At first, she almost felt sorry for David. Carly had never loved anyone the way she loved him, and the thought that she might never feel that way again was a sobering thought. She had originally intended to claim only the house and leave everything else to him, but 2 weeks of anger had hardened her heart. She was going to take whatever the marriage contract guaranteed her, which was half his share of the company. In the beginning, David had 3 partners, and it was they who insisted on a prenuptial agreement to protect their interests. They all also had agreements with their wives. Over time, David bought them out one by one, but the marriage contract remained clear. She was entitled to half his share. She was going to take every last one, minus the cost of his half of the house. Carly didn't think his business would survive, but David had no one to blame but himself. If it worked, if he were even half as hard on his business and their marriage as he was on his novel, he wouldn't be in this situation. Carly sat in the kitchen, enjoying the morning sun that streamed through the window. There was an amazing mixture of relief and determination inside her. She knew there was still a lot of work ahead, but she was ready to cope with any difficulties. There were legal battles, emotional struggles, and a lot of changes ahead of her, but she was confident that she could get through it with her head held high. The following week, Carly went to the law firm to discuss the divorce process with her lawyer. Charlie was there, supporting her, and she felt confident knowing that she had such friends. The meeting was successful, and they began preparing documents for divorce. When Carly handed David the divorce papers, he was stunned. He did not expect that she would find out about his infidelity and take such drastic measures. His anger and attempts to justify himself had no effect on Carly, who remained calm and collected. She made it clear that their marriage was over, and she intended to move on. The divorce process was not easy, but Carly endured it with dignity. David tried to fight for his assets, but the prenuptial agreement was on her side. In the end, she received half of his share in the company and the house. Her lawyer made sure all conditions were met so Carly could begin the next chapter of her life with confidence. After her divorce, Carly decided to focus on her career and personal life. She continued teaching and working on research projects, and also began taking yoga classes and volunteering. Her life became more balanced and rich. A few months passed, and Carly felt ready to reopen herself to a new relationship. She began attending social events and meetings, and soon met Mark, a kind and considerate man who appreciated her for who she was. Their relationship developed slowly but surely, and Carly felt that she had finally found someone who could become her true partner in life. In the end, Carly realized that her experience with David, despite all the pain and betrayal, made her stronger and wiser. She learned to value herself and her needs, and this led her to true happiness. Life went on, and Carly moved forward with confidence, knowing that her future was in her hands. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even click to the next one.